Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 2, the bottom of page 1163. Aleph Kuf Samach Gimel. So, middle of the topic, how in Atzilus itself, they're both perspectives of Das Elyon, Das Tachten, which he explained that in Atzilus you have two different elements. One is that there's a structure. There's clearly a gvul of Chachma Bina, a geder of Chachma Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura. And that gvul comes through a tzimtzum, as he explained. The tzimtzum that conceals the infinite power behind the divine energy. And that allows the Sefiros to emerge, but the Sefiros are structured, and even in their root, they are rooted in the 10 hidden spheres. Right. The only thing is that they're still in a state of tachlis ha'achdus ve'eskalus, as he said. There, it's all part of one larger picture, where everything is unified and connected. Antu chad v'lei b'chushbin. But in Atzilus itself, which is a combination of, in Atzilus itself, it comes into a structured specific spheres. Okay. On the other hand, Atzilus also has another element to it. They are divine spheres. They are a revelation of Elikus. Yes, through Chesed, Gvura, and the other specifics, but they are revelation. They're not just concealment. So in addition to the tzimtzum, there's also an emanation of spheres. The Maitzil emanated his attributes into Atzilus. And as such, they are divine. In contrast to the Biyah, which is a Yesh. In Atzilus, it's Iyu v'chayu yichad, Iyu v'gamu yichad. It's divine. As he says, that even though the reason for that is because if it was only tzimtzum, then you just have concealment. That's not the kavanah. In the words of the Maimer, the im haya isavus aydei tzimtzum hari haya helam legamri. And the nevraim would be complete yesh. But the kavanah is not that. Is that there should be bitl hayesh. So it's true, to create the yesh, you need the tzimtzum and you need the structure. But to create bitl hayesh, and there should be Gili Alakus Be'elam, that is rooted in Atzilus, the fact that it's a Gili of Alakus. So the Tzimtzum itself is also structured in a way that will allow for Gili. It's not an airtight, sealed concealment. Okay, and that's the Tzimtzum Netzola Asasfir. So there you have both elements. You have a sense of, you have the structure, but you also have a sense of the divine within the structure. Yeah. And he actually said that compared to Eidei and Sof, Atzilus would be called Gvul, but compared to Biyah, it would be called Bli Gvul. And again, even though it comes to a Tzimtzum, he says, Hagam, the Ima Yesh Nesavai de Tzimtzum. And in that sense, they're like chutz latzmusei. They're like a kavyochel. They are like outside of the realm of the infinite possibilities, the infinite divine Ein Sof consciousness. Nevertheless, there's still a revelation, and their creation, their hisavus of the spheres is through kiruv mahamaitzel. Means that they're close to and they relate to the emanator, to the source. And that's the meaning. It's dveikus u'miyachodim be'eidei ein sof. So Atzilus is connected and attached to its source, in contrast to the yesh. So Atzilus is the perfect interface because it has both elements in it. It has the structure of existence, but it's completely absorbed and completely connected to the divine. Okay. And that's why Bohem, Val Yodam, I'm reading the last three lines now, and I'm going to continue at page 1163. Ulechein, Bohem, meaning in this 10 spheres of Atzilus, Val Yodam, and through them, Nimshel Gamke Gilei Elokus Be'elam. Because they're a revelation of divine energy, albeit in a limited form, but still divine energy, meaning limited as in Chesed, Gvura, and the structure, they are a Gili Elokus Be'elam. They through them comes revelation. The Mitzad Hagbola Shebem Hareim B'chinis Mokel L'Gvul, due to the Hagbola, the structure of Atzilus, they're a source for the Gvul, U'Mitzias the Biyah, U'Mitzad Shem B'Kol Mokel B'chinis Gili Me'erin Sof, Nimshel Behem HaGili Be'elams. So due to their structure, their limit, their defined structure, they are a source for the Gvul and existence of Biyah, Briyatzia Asiyah, and due to the fact that there's still a Gili, they retain their divine revelation element. Through that comes the revelation in the worlds. You may recall in volume 1, when he spoke about the Sefiros, he said the Sefiros have three meanings: number, story, mispar, sipur, story, narrative, and sapir, like the Evan sapir, the sapphire that's transparent. Then he gave a fourth interpretation, sefer. But the point being is that the Sefiros, even on the number level, they do reveal something. They reveal not the full picture, but then the narrative, the deeper Sefiros also reveal the story behind existence until they become transparent channels for the divine. What's my point? That from there you see that the Sefiros are not forces of concealment, they're forces of revelation. The only question is, how much do they reveal? Do they reveal just the structural element, or do they tell a story, or do they reveal even the higher levels? If you recall then, we learned then, he spoke about even revealing the bligvul of Elokus. Because as I said yesterday, or the other day, the example, even though the art is limited, but from the art you can arrive to the artist, and you can understand the forces behind the art as they stand within the artist, and you can climb through that. Obviously, there are places that you're going to come to that are beyond the artist altogether, and definitely there's places that are beyond the 10 spheres, the sphere of Saint Ketz, the infinite possibilities. But as we've learned, that from the point of view of Elokus, the 10 spheres are just one possibility among infinite ones. So they're really a piece of bligvul, just in the form of a gvul, meaning expressed in one particular fashion. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that the Sefiros play a tremendous role, the key role, to all the revelations we will have in existence. But in Atzilus, they're regulated, and the filter of Atzilus allows it to be accepted and received by the structure. In other words, Atzilus is that interface that is required for the teacher to reach the student. Take that away, and you won't be able to either be too much concealment or there'll be too much revelation. So you need to have the perfect balance to be able to create existence as a yesh, and then give it the power to be able to discover Elokus. And that's the world in which we live. That you have, obviously we are a yesh to the point that we could even feel that we're self-contained, but we have the capacity to bitla yesh. So that is coming from the power of Atzilus that allows us to climb. In simple terms, when you have an Avram, Yitzchak, Yankov, when you have a Rebbe, and you have examples of people, neshamas, that are living on earth as exactly aligned with what the Eibishter wants, that is a role model and a guide, and guides us and teaches us. So there you have it. So even though we may be on our level, but these entities or these people, essentially Atzilus has the capacity, allows us to learn from it how what chesed should look like, what gvura should look like, how we should behave, how we should live our lives. Okay. Now he's going to go back, last line, literally the last few words on this page. We're going to move to 1164. He's going to explain, remember the question he asked? He explained the first question. What is afikas? That after you say antu chad, you are one, and not a measurable one. So that, he explained, is higher than Atzilus. Then comes antu dafikas, and you are the one that from you emerges 10 spheres. So he explained that. Now, but there's still, in the question that's still hanging, which is, what are the two expressions? Esa Tikkunim, the Karinan on Esa Sfirin, Lanhoga behind Alman. He didn't just say 10 spheres. He said, you emanated, or from you emerged 10 Tikkunim. And the Karinan, and they're called 10 spheres, with which you govern the universe, existence, as we learned. So what are these two expressions? Now he's going to answer that. It says like this, V'zehu, literally the last three words on the page. V'zehu she'emer, and this is what the Pasuk Eliyahu says. Next page, 1164. Esa Tikkunim, v'karinan lon esa sfirin. 10 Tikkunim. I translate Tikkunim could be ornaments. It could be repairs, but that's not really the word here. It's not a repairs. It's more a type of revelation, a tikkun, different meanings for it. But often jewelry is called tikkunim. You adorn something with tikkunim. V'karina lon esa sfiris, and call them 10 spheres. So he says like this: Sha esa sfiris nikra tikkunim. The 10 spheres are called tikkunim. The pirish tikkunim hu levushim. Like jewelry, tikkunim are not part of who you are. It's a levush, it's a garment that you wear in order to beautify or adorn something. So the tikkunim here is attaching levushim, garments. Ukamoishe targum unkelis. Sometimes I think this is not necessarily targum unkelis. It could also be targum. He says targum unkelis. But there's a footnote from the Rebbe somewhere, but I remember working on it, where we don't find it in Targum Unkelis, we find it more in Targum Yerushalmi or Targum Yonason. Anyway, he says Targum Unkelis on the Pasuk in Kiseitze. La Yilbush Gever, it says that a man shouldn't wear clothing of a woman. So he metargum there in Aramaic, Lo Yistaken Gever. So he teaches Lo Yilbush, Lo Yistaken. Do not dress as lo yistaken gever. Someone has a chumash, if you don't mind looking it up, maybe we could see. Maybe it isn't Targum Unkelis. I remember something about it that it's not so pashut. But regardless, that's what he's saying. So we see from this that tikkun and levush are the same idea. In Aramaic, the vush is translated as a tikkun. Or here the verb to dress, la yilbush gever, a gever should not dress. So lo yistaken gever. In other words, he shouldn't adorn himself. He shouldn't dress himself. Lefi, why is this the case? Why are Esa spheres called levushim? L'chayda, you could argue they're called eris and kalim. Why are they called levushim? His lefi sha Esa spheres and levushim le'erein sev baruch hu. Because the 10 spheres compared to erein sev baruch hu, they're a garment to the infinite divine light. Remember, the infinite divine light is beyond the spheres. Loi b'chushbon, as he said. I think that he even used the expression Sefiros ein ketz. Was that used on last page? Yeah, Sefiros ein ketz. So the 10 spheres are indeed an expression of Elikus, but compared to Ein Sof, they are levushim le'Ein Sof. Like we just discussed, in order that they should serve as being a source for the worlds, the defined and the finite worlds. So the Esa Sefiros are serving as a in-between, an interface between the Ein Sof and the Elamis Bal Gvul. So in that sense, the Esa Sefiros are levushim, so to speak, garments of the Ein Sof, that the Ein Sof dresses up in these garments in order to create existence. For example, when you say, Ba'asara ma'amoris nivra ela, you're saying the Eibishter, God, is saying these 10 statements. So the 10 statements, he's dressing up his Elikus in Yehi Yehi Rakia, Yehi Teitzeres Desha. So he's calling the Esa Sefiros, therefore, levushim, garments for the Ein Sof. In a way, you could say it's the artist who has all the infinite possibilities and he wants to now convey them through this one piece of art. So he has to dress himself in those garments, meaning in a specific details. In this case, it's the 10 spheres. Okay. V'zeu shenikra b'shem midas b'chlal. And this is why the spheres in general are called midas. Now remember, midas we usually interpret as being emotions. But midas, if you think about it, the word midah in Hebrew means measure. A midah, v'shir. From the word b'chlal, shehu lashon madu bad. Measure bad linen. Basically, it's a measure, it's a word that comes from the word measuring. I'm not sure where that lashon is. Looks like a lashon akosuf. Madu bad, bad. Midday bad. So what does midday mean there? Like a garment. What does the actual word midday mean there? Okay. It's either connected to a garment or it's connected to measure. I think he means here garment because midday bad of lavish kohen. So it's a form midday bad means the kohen will dress in a garment of a linen garment. So not the word midday. I correct myself. I thought he was trying to say that it comes from the word measure, but from the word levush. The klolos esespheres hem bechinas levushim levad, because the general 10 spheres are only garments. The gabe erein sof hamaitzil. Compared to the Erein Sof, the infinite divine emanator. Sha Erein Sof poil bahem. The infinite divine works through them. They're like instruments of his. He works poil bahem. Through them he works through them. Val yodam poil bahem in them. Val yodam and through them hisavas elim is biyah. So the Erein Sof manifests into these 10 spheres. These are the garments, like a person dressing in a garment, and in them and through them creates existence that, as we know it, the structured existence, which is defined by the 10 spheres, which are clothing the Erein Sof within them. So that's why they're called Tikkunim. Umakal Mokim. But then there's the other side of it, remember, in Atzilus. The other side of it is Makal Mokim, and nevertheless, Al Yodam Nimshal Gamkim Hagili Be'elamis. Remember, this is not just garments in order to create the structure, there's also another function here, that through them should be a gili in the Elamis. Not just the creation, like we've discussed many times. One thing is to define the structure, but also there should be a gili, not complete concealment. And that's why the Pasuk Eliyahu says that emerged from him 10 tikkunim, 10 garments, and he calls them 10 spheres because sphere, lashon spheres ubehiris. The word sphera comes from different meanings, but one of them is spheres behiris, from illumination and shining, glowing. Shehem bechinas gili er. They're in the form of a gili er, a revelation. Now, just to explain a moment, a garment is still, you can still say a garment reveals, but a garment is more of a concealer than a revealer. Ad kedei kach, that you can see a person puts on a garment, you don't even know what kind of person it is. You can put on a garment that conceals what's beneath the surface. We even learned earlier that there are garments that are complete concealers. Sphira, on the other hand, its very name means reveal. So what he's saying is that the spheres play two roles. One, they serve as garments, but they're also revealing garments. Like when you say the Melech puts on levushe malchus. It's not just garments, they're also garments that reflect that he's a king. Royal garments. Now the king, of course, can dress up in garments of a peasant. He can dress up in garments and hide himself, like the various stories and Mishalim we learn about how a king went and hid himself by wearing regular layman garments. But it could also be garments that reveal. So he's saying that Pasuk Eliyahu is telling us with these two statements that from Antu Chad Alei B'Chushbon emerged 10 garments. These are the 10 spheres to create the structure of existence. The Karinalon, and they are called spheres because they're also gili, from the word spheres that illuminate and shine and glow. So essentially, the 10 spheres play both roles and therefore have both names. Each name indicates another role of the spheres, the role of the spheres. Like he said earlier, you can't just have Helam because we need a Gili. You can't just have Gili because we need a structure. So you need to have a structure, which is part of the Levushim and the Tzimtzum that leads to that, but a structure that's not airtight, that allows something to shine through. You could almost say it's Levushim that are a little more, they're not opaque, that they are transparent in a way, that they're Levushim that allow a Lakus to shine through them, but through a Levush, just like when you have curtains or you have tinted glass, you have the Levush that allows the glow to come in, but in a way that does not destroy or annihilate the structure of existence. This was also explained at length much earlier when we learned about Levushim and Eris and Kalim. Even what we mentioned before, Eris, Kalim, Levushim, and Heichalis. We may even recall that sometimes the Sefiros are compared to faculties. Sometimes Keiches HaNefesh are called Levushei HaNefesh. But sometimes Keiches HaNefesh are like the skeleton, which is part of the body, and Levushim is Machshava Dibur Maisa. So it's really relative, depending. Bottom line is, a Levush is always something in addition to the thing that is dressing up in that garment. And there could be different manifestations of that. But here he's explained that even the spheres can be called Levushim for that reason, because it's somewhat a yitziyah, like he said, somewhat of an expression that's not the pure divine as it is without Levushim. Even in Tanya, when he brings the pasuk, Lo yikonaf eid merecha, v'hoye neches reisas merecha, that there no longer will be a kanaf, a garment, that will conceal the divine. Today we need it because we would become completely nullified if there was no garment through which Alakus shines. Like Shemesh Mogin, Hashem Elikim. You need the Elikim, the Mogin, to filter to channel the sunlight. But Lo Yikonaf Eid Merech is when La'asulavi, once the world is refined, the garment can be removed. But I don't want to go into that right now. Right now he's talking about it in a very basic level. So the spheres have both these roles. So right now we see how Atzilus, we already see two dimensions. It's already very clear, das tach das elyon. Though I don't want to jump the gun, he didn't say it yet, but it's becoming quite apparent where he's leading to. So with that said, does anybody want to ask anything before? If not, I'll just continue from the next paragraph on page 1164. Any questions? No. Okay, good. Okay. V'zehu gamkein, next paragraph on page 1164. V'zehu gamkein ha'hefesh bein esses spheres Atzilus shenikra Tikkunim. And this is also the difference between the 10 spheres of Atzilus that are called Tikkunim. Shezo b'chinas levushim. This is the level of garments, as we just discussed. And the difference between that, ubein masha emer achakach levushim tikkinus la'on. So now he's going to be medayik more in the Pasuk Eliyahu. He didn't mention this phrase yet. So if you look in Pasuk Eliyahu, there's a bunch of different things. So really you're getting a beer we're going to say Pasuk Eliyahu later this afternoon. So you're getting a beer here from the Rebbe Rashab firsthand in Pasuk Eliyahu. So now, after he says, Antu dafikus eser tikkunim v'krin lan eser sfirin lanhoge b'hein almin. Then a little later, a few lines later, he says the following. Or actually, it's the next line, maybe. It says, Achakach levushin tikkinus lun. So what is levushin tikkinus lun? You just said that already. You just said that the sphere, that the afiku that emerged from the divine oneness emerged tikkunim, the karinon, and they're called Sefiros. So what's this now? What are you saying now? Levushin tikkinun, that he adorned it or he dressed it with garments. So he's saying that this is adding now another level of levush, not the Atzilus levush, not the 10 spheres of Atzilus. She'elas biyah nikra levushim. Elas biyah is called levushim as well. So he's asking, since Elam Biyah also called levushim, kiva shagam Elam Atzilus nikra gam ken b'shel levushim, ma'u hefresh b'neim. Let me go back to the nigun. I didn't read it the right song, so to speak. V'zel gam ken ben Atzilus Atzilus nikra Tikkunim shezav b'chinas levushim. U'be'ma she'em achkach levushim Tikkunis lan she'em eslaban nikra levushim. So what is the difference between? Yeah, that's what he's saying, basically. The second statement referring to biyah, that's also called levushim. Since also Atzilus is called levushim, so then umawa hefresh beineim. What is the difference between these two levels of garments? Atzilus, the 10 spheres of Atzilus, and the second statement, which is referring to biyah. Ha'inyan hu, the language is a little, you have to read it a little carefully, because first he says is biyah, and then he says umawa hefresh beineim. Because he starts with zeu gam ken hefresh. This is also the difference. So he's going to explain now the difference. Ha'inyan hu, the inyan in this is the difference between these two levels of garments. She has beis min and levushim. There are two types of garments. Levush atzmi u levush hanifred. Levush atzmi means a levush that is part of the thing that is dressing. It's not an external element. It's not like a shirt or a jacket, which is what he calls a levush hanifred. A levush hanifred means the garment is separate from the entity that you're dressing up, but it's a garment. Levush atzmi, as we're going to learn shortly, is a levush, like for example, he's going to say kamtza, levush, kadein kamtza, the levush minei bay. Like for example, a snail, or for that matter, a turtle, where they have a shell, but the shell is not an outside garment. It's part of the creature itself. So in other words, you can have a garment that's part of the entity. Like for example, skin would be more of a levush atzmi, because you can't take it off and put it on. You can't be patient to levish. It's part of that, and it protects you. A levush nifred is removable, basically. So he's saying, here's the difference. Umasha esses Sefiros, Atzilus, nikra levushim hu she'em b'chinas levush atzmi. When we call Atzilus the 10 spheres Atzilus levushim, yes, they're levush compared to Ein Sof, but they're levush atzmi. They are part and parcel of Ein Sof. A levush because they're the instruments through which he channels the power of creation into a structure. But levush atzmi, ukadiisa b'medrash, like it says in Medrash, al pasuk v'hine ish levush habadim. So the pasuk says, "Hine ish levush habadim." Here's the man who's dressed in linen. Says the Medrash, what's the example for that? What is he dressed in linen? He says, "Kadein like." Kadein means like. An example, kamtza. Kamtza is usually interpreted as a snail. There are different people, different interpretations. The levushay minei ubei. His garment is minei ubei. It's part of it, part of the very entity. The shell or the garment is part of the very entity, minei ubei. Okay, he didn't explain it, he just said this is one type of levush. And this will be understood with an example. For example, keiches hanefesh, shein levushim el hanefesh. Okay, so the nefesh is the spirit itself. It's the spirit of the divine. Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, and the human being came alive. That's a nefesh. Nefesh Adam. But then there are faculties. When a person's alive, they also have faculties. It's not just you're alive as a general statement that you can move, that you're a living entity. There are faculties. The power to see, the power to hear, the power to think, to conceive, to feel. So how do you distinguish between the keiches hanefesh and the nefesh itself? Says the Rebbe Rashab, shein levushim el hanefesh. The keiches are called and considered like garments to the nefesh. They're not the nefesh itself, and the nefesh is not a sum of the parts. The nefesh is an indivisible a divisible energy, divine energy, and it contains the capacity for particular faculties. Generally speaking, that's Chachma, Bina, Das, through Malchus. The essence Sefiros nishtalshlom into the Keiches HaNefesh. So the Rebbe Rashab is using now the faculties of the soul, human faculties. They're garments to the Nefesh. That Nefesh or Er Poshet, because the Nefesh is a Er Poshet, is a seamless, shapeless energy. She'ena b'chinas is chalkos keiches. That's not comprised of or made up of a distinct faculties. Like the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, Sefer Shalbenim, chapter 51. So then where the keiches fit in, so he says, V'ha-keiches the seichel midas, the faculties of intelligence and of emotions, the cognitive and emotional faculties. Einon atzmis ha-nefesh. They are not the core soul. They're faculties of the soul, but they're not the core soul. So you could say they're expressions of the soul, but they're not the core soul. In other words, if you ask someone, is your soul Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed? You say, these are faculties of my soul. These are attributes. But my soul is beyond them, is something above and beyond them. And now the Rebbe Rashab qualifies this. Because if you know Tanya, and Pei Gimel of Tanya seems to contradict this statement. So he says, and what it says in Tanya in chapter 3, there's an expression, there he uses an expression, they're atzmus nefesh. Remember I mentioned machshava dibra maisa levushim. Because machshava dibra maisa you can constantly change. What you're thinking about, what you're speaking about, what you're doing are like garments. You can remove them, you can change them. The keiches you can't change. You're born with certain faculties. You can develop them. They can be concealed, but they're part of who you are. That's what he says in Pei Gimel. So why are you telling me they're not atzmis hanefesh? So he says, Zeu rak legabe halavushim de machshava dibra ma'aser shebe Pei Dalet sham. Because there he's talking it in context, and this is in context of the levushim in chapter 4. So as I just said, machshava dibra ma'aser, you could think right now, Chassidus. A minute later, you can think about nigla. Third minute, you can think about something else. Machshava is not an etzem part of who you are. Machshava is just the garment which your mind is now in dressing up in to think. Same thing with speech. You can speech is neutral. It's a neutral garment that can be used for kedusha, Rachmana litzlan, for hepech kedusha, or for neutral matters. So compared to that, he says. So we say atzmus hanefesh. He says that's only in comparison to the 3 levushim that he speaks about in Pei Dalet. Aval be'etzem. But if you compare it to the nefesh, which is higher than the faculties, be'etzem gam ha'seichel midas. But fundamentally, at the core, when you talk about it as an objective subject, not in comparison to the machshav, thought, speech, and action, gam ha'seichel midas hein rak kelim u'levushim. Also, in the intellect and emotions, the faculties of are only kelim, containers and garments u'levushim la'atzmus hanefesh, to the core soul. So as I pointed out earlier, it's all relative. If you talk about the core soul, that's the etzem. The keiches hanefesh are an add-on, so to speak. They are an expression of the soul, faculties of the soul. As we're going to learn in a moment, that's levushim atzmim, because a keich you can't change. It's part of the soul. It's not it's lower than the core soul, but it is an expression of the core soul.
It's like skin, like you said before, like skin.
Relatively speaking, the difference would be the internal organs would be more atzmi, like let's say the heart, the liver, and so on. The bones and the skin would be like the kelim and levushim atzmim, because you can't remove them, but they're also only a garment in the sense they only protect and cover up. They're not the etzem of who you are. And a garment that you put on, let's say a coat or a sweater or a jacket or whatever, would be levushim nifrodim, like machshava dibra ma'aser. That would be in the body itself. Yeah, that would be an example in the body. I don't know if he's going to bring that here, but we spoke about it in volume 1. He gave that example, I believe, if I recall correctly. You want me to tell you where? You interested?
If you want. I mean, I just wanted to get it clear in my mind.
Yeah, that way I just said it. That's how it is. What I just said is definitely that way. I just if you want to see inside where he discussed this was with the context of the spheres, actually. The different meaning of Sefiros. It's around, let's see here. It's around 180, a little later, maybe 100 and so. It's even later. I thought it was earlier. Okay. Yeah. Basically, 200 and on, page 200 and on, he discusses this.
Rabbi Jacobson.
Just one second. Yeah, go ahead, Eliezer. Yeah.
Levushim Atzmim, they would think that the only one that could really be truly called one that you cannot separate from the nefesh itself would be the brain. I mean, even a heart can be removed, kidneys can be removed, livers can be removed. No?
This is not a medical journal. We're not talking about whether you can physically remove it. You could also remove a brain, and then the person is dead. You could remove a brain.
But these other organs can be removed, and the person would not die.
But it's not relevant. We're not discussing medical medicine here.
Yes, Rabbi Akiva.
The soul is intact, even if you remove the brain. The soul remains intact. It just won't be in a body. It's a soul without a body. Bottom line, the whole body is a levush atzmi in a sense, because it's all connected to the soul while you're alive. God forbid, after death, they separate. But anyway, it's not, I wouldn't get hooked up, I wouldn't get hung up on the words separate or not separate. It means it's not the core essence of the soul. It's a faculty of the soul.
Gotcha.
Now, the truth is, if you really want to know, the nefesh, even without a body, has chachma, bina, das, and so on. Even Lamaila. They learn Teda, and Neshama learns Teda without a physical body. I was just using an example. Look, let's just distinguish. There's 3 things going on here. I used an example from the body being the inner organs, the skin and the bones, let's say, and then real physical garments. That's a mushal, just a mushal. For the etzema nefesh, its faculties, and machshava dibra ma'aser, the garments that the faculties dress up in. Lamaila, its etzem ha'elikus, that's higher than spheres, would be atzmi. Then the 10 spheres of Atzilus would be like the keiches hanefesh, or like we spoke here, the skin and the bones, and the biyah would be levush nifred, would be like machshava dibra ma'aser. That's just it's just 3 different. We can't mix the 3. It's just trying to explain how there's different levels of levushim, basically. I just want to stop a second because I want to see something. I just noticed they talks about das and das tachten here as well. That I didn't remember. Okay, I'll go back to that later. The mimer is the mimer of the Elatelis, Ayin Beis, Ayin Gimel. Okay, I'll check it out later.
Does a person's neshama orients the Esther Sefiros of Genuzos, Litnei Tzimtzum? What does a person's neshama does that have those kochos atzmi in the before Tzimtzum or only in the Atzilus? When is this unity between the Etzem and Nefesh?
Before the Tzimtzum, there's no human beings and there's no existence of anything.
No Nefesh even? No Nefesh?
Nothing. I wouldn't discuss before the Tzimtzum in this context. If you want to find an example of before the Tzimtzum, and after the Tzimtzum in our beings,
yes, that's
but that I wouldn't go on. This is a completely different discussion. That's not relevant here.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out when it puts on its first lavush, the etzem of a person's etzem.
It's all relative. The person or God?
No, the person.
Well, we have to first be created and be born before we put on a lavush.
Right. So when is that nefesh created? In Tohu and Atzilus?
Everything is after the Tzimtzum. Creation, by definition, is post-Tzimtzum.
Post-Tzimtzum. And the Or Ein Sof, or would we say that the Atzmus itself takes on a lavush in the Ayin Shal Yeshamiti? Would that be considered a lavush for Atzmus?
Only if the Rebbe Rashab said, no, I wouldn't make such a jump to such a statement at this point. If the Rebbe Rashab says it, it's one thing. I would not say it, put it that way.
Okay.
In relatively speaking, anything that's not Atzmus,
right,
would be a form of a lavush if you want to use the word.
Right.
But then you're just using words. I mean, the point of the matter is, Eir Ein Sof is not Atzmus. It is lower than Atzmus, and Atzmus does, so to speak, use it as an expression. So, but I would not go and venture to call it a name like that, unless the Maimorim call it that name, because the concept of Eir generally as a lavush is usually in the creation of Eir that's later after the Tzimtzum. But it could be that in some Maimorim he may talk about the levels of Eiris before the Tzimtzum in context of a lavush. But right now, the problem that I want to stay away from is not connect this to anything else. It'll just confuse matters. The goal right now is to understand the pshat of this mimer and this page right now. So let me make sure that we're on the set. We're focused here. The focus is the following. He's explaining now Pasach Eliyahu that calls the 10 spheres levushim, tikkunim, which are called spheres. He explained that the levush part is more the structure, and more like, and the spheres part is more the illumination, the light. Now he's continuing in this paragraph to explain. So, what is the difference between the two different expressions of levush that we use in Pasach Eliyahu? That afterwards it says. Like he says here, levush into kinuslan, that you dressed it up in garments. What's the difference between the garments of Atzilus when you call them the Sefiros? Are the levushim of the 10 spheres are called Tikkunim levushim and the levushim of Biyah. So far he's explained that there's two levels of levushim, one that's separate and one that's part of the essential entity. And he brought the medrash levushay minei obey, something whose garment is part and parcel of the entity itself, still a garment. And to explain that, he gave the example of Keiches HaNefesh, where he says they're levushim. Why they're levushim? Because the nefesh itself is pashut, doesn't have any parts. It's indivisible. The Keiches, on the other hand, are faculties. And they're called levushim, like he says in Tanya, they're called the air pashut, like he says in Tanya chapter 51. But then he qualified. What about it says in chapter 3, he says they're atzmus hanefesh. She says that's only because it's in regard to the machshava dibur ma'isa of chapter 4. That's what he said. Aval be'etzem gam ha'seichel mitzvah that kelim v'levushim la'atzmus hanefesh. They're only containers and garments. Now remember, even containers and garments are sometimes seen as two entities. Here he's using it as one general statement, a container like a garment. Because the truth is a container is sometimes more atzmi and a levush is more separate. But here he's talking about the keiches hanefesh as being both containers and garments to the etzem nefesh. Didn't finish, still continuing. The kamoisha hamoyach hagashmi. Just as the physical brain, hura keli l'keich haseichel. So the physical brain is a physical entity that is created in a way that is conducive to be a keli, a container for intelligence, for the mind. So just as the physical brain is only a container for the power of intelligence, for intelligence and wisdom that extends from the nefesh, same thing, similarly, the power of intelligence in the nefesh, on a higher level, is only a container for the core essence of the nefesh. So he's making this comparison. The brain, the physical brain, is obviously a container for the intelligence within it. Intelligence is a container for the nefesh from where the intelligence comes from. That's what he says here very explicitly.
Is each level of the neshama a container for or a levush for the higher levels? Is that the way it works until you get to Yechida?
He's not discussing that here. He's discussing simply a soul and its faculties. He's not discussing higher levels now. I'll just give you a little tip. The way I learned this, I don't allow anything I know from other Maimorim to really play into the discussion here, except if it mamish helps understand this. Because if not, you're going to get yourself into not really understanding this completely. What you're doing now is connecting it to things you learned about Yechida. He's not talking about Nefesh Ruach Neshama Chai Yechida altogether. He's simply talking about what garments mean, two levels of garments, and he's using the faculties of the soul as an example for it. Okay. Let me see now. Now is going to come a parenthesis, which is not so short, I see. So maybe we stop here then. There's going to be a parenthesis, then there's a parenthesis within the parentheses. And where does it end? Anybody sees where this parenthesis ends?
There's one on the next page, on the 6th, 7th line.
In the Shula Agilian, at the bottom of the page, the Rebbe says it's missing the end of the parenthesis.
That's the second parenthesis, not the first one.
There's one on the 6th, 7th line in the middle of page 1165.
Hold on.
If that's where it ends, I'm not. Or is that the second parenthesis? And there's another one at the end of the paragraph. No, that's.
Yeah, it ends there on the word after the word bilvad, on the next page, the 6th line, the next page. So it's a very long parenthesis. That's going to be like a discussion within a discussion on this topic. If you asked me, it seems to me that the Rebbe Rashab is adding some material here, probably may even be answering questions that he received at the time, and he's filling in some gaps because some of these discussions were much earlier in Ayin Beis, and it seemingly logically would fit there. But it looks like he's just filling in some details here, which aren't tangential, but they're not the first time this is discussed. That's how I would interpret this. So there's a long parentheses. That bilvad, 2 parentheses will end there. The first one and the second one. Yeah. Okay. So we'll stop here. We'll stop by the parentheses. So essentially, we know now that there is levush atzmi, which he's comparing to the koiches hanefesh, and there's levush nifred, which he didn't get to yet. That's going to be more like machshava dibra ma'isa, I'm assuming. And that's going to explain the difference between the levushim of Atzilus and the levushim of Biyah. And then we're going to go back to the fact that Atzilus has both elements. But it's relevant because we're discussing here how we bring godliness into Biyah, which is a thicker and a more separate garment that allows the yesh to emerge more. In Atzilus, the garment at the end of the day, like we said, is somewhat transparent because it's still also called Sefiros, which are illuminators. So basically, he's talking about how the Ayr and the Ayr is getting more diminished, but at the same time is still being revealed in Atzilus, and then Biyah gets more concealed. That's the gist of it. And we'll get back to, I'll continue on Sunday as we